wanted to discuss with you guys kind of an effort mostly conducted at the Rue Institute over the last couple of years on kind of evaluating wake steering data using machine learning, and in particular incorporating or trying to combine data from multiple pairs of turbines on a wind plant. So I'll get more into the details of that. This work was largely conducted by initially postdoc Cheng Zhang, and then a graduate student, Melvin Lugo Alvarez, and as well as supported by another graduate student, Daniel Kerrigan, and a colleague of mine at Northeastern while I was there, Eleonora Tronci. And we were able to leverage a proprietary data set provided by Windesco. For those of you that may not know at this point, I left Northeastern this past summer, and I'm focusing on my own consulting business called Wind Tester LLC. And get us to the next slide here. So kind of the question to start off the story here, and you'll see there are a couple of other colleagues involved early on in this. What can we learn about wind turbine wake steering leveraging machine learning? And the idea here is if we can take a complex physical phenomenon or scenario and train a machine learning model to be able to accurately represent what's happening, we can then interrogate that model and learn more about sort of the underlying behavior or identify things that might be going on in it. So that's really what our idea was to start with here. And we did some initial studies. I presented this back, I guess 2 years ago at West, or sorry, when was this? Anyway, a couple of years ago. And the, not at West, at Torque, sorry about that. But anyway, the data set we used here was the Smart Aeoli, which of course just had one yawing turbine, basically, or one steered turbine, I should say. And we were considering the effect on turbine 5, the downwind turbine. Of course, everyone's familiar with this situation. But the thought here is kind of we change our perspective on this. So we look at it as the downstream turbine as a sensor that's sensing the wake intensity that is hitting it. And so as the wind direction changes, the position of that downstream turbine in the wake changes. And we can look at how that wake deficit varies for different yaw angles over that. And so we trained a machine learning model on this data set and then predicted essentially in this case, the log power ratio as a function of the reference wind direction for different vane angles. And then you can map that out. Well, where is the minimum of this? And it can be done with different models. And then where does that minimum occur for different steering angles in terms of that relative wind direction? And what we're effectively measuring is the wake deflection. So that's kind of where things started out. And now to jump into today's topic, when we look at what's mostly been done with existing experimental data on wind farm flow control, it's primarily, most of the times, focused on a single upwind downwind turbine pair, or at least evaluating that one at a time for a specific wind direction range where that waking occurs. And as has been noted, analysis takes a lot of time to converge. Inherently, there's the variable or uncertainty in the experimental data makes it a bit challenging. And so here we said, okay, what can we do? Can we potentially save time, as in experimental time, if we can look at combining what information from multiple turbine pairs? We were privileged to have access to this data set, which is a subset of 8 turbines of a wind plant, all of which were subjected to wake steering controls. And as you can see, the wind farm for the 7 months of data that we had a, relatively speaking, fairly uniform or multi-directional wind rows. So we had wind coming from different directions, causing waking of different pairs of turbines. And so this brings us into the sort of feature engineering side of this, where we say, okay, let's pick any one of the turbines. We're going to pick all of them, but starting with one of them, and look at, for a given wind direction, what is the upwind turbine of interest. And then, as you can see here, for a different wind direction, a different turbine becomes the upwind turbine. And we're going to pick the turbine that is has the smallest magnitude relative wind angle between that wind direction vector and the physical vector, position vector between the turbines. And you'll note that for different pairs of turbines, we also get a different distance, d, between them, which becomes an additional feature. Now we can go and expand this and say, okay, for every downwind turbine, what is the closest relative wind direction angle to an upwind turbine? And so we have a pair for every turbine for every data point. And now we need to start filtering it. So the thinking here is we wanted to simplify our problem a little bit and eliminate sectors or eliminate situations where multiple turbine wakes are impacting our downwind turbine of interest. And this would be done for every downwind turbine, but for right now, we're just going to pick an example one here. By the way, the turbine numbers are arbitrarily assigned by Windesco in their data acquisition system, so it's just a unique identifier for us. And so for this downwind turbine, we see that, wind coming from the southeast here will have, southwest, I misspoke. We'll have, multiple turbines waking it from these directions. And so we're going to require a sector width of at least 10 degrees on each side of that upwind turbine as a way of, to a large extent, filtering out multiple wakes. There's some evidence that we ended up filtering later that this wasn't adequate all the time, as you can imagine. And then we need to think about our target for our machine learning. Typically in analysis, you would look at using some reference power, either from a power curve in the wind speed or from some turbine that's not impacted. But now we're really in a bit of a challenging situation in terms of defining a reference power. And we wanted to keep it to, really the data of this pair of turbines. So we've chosen to define power ratio as just the ratio of the downwind turbine to the upwind turbine. And, refinement of this could happen in the future, but basically when we look at, the Flora simulation of this in region 2, we do see, with the dashed lines, when we do the power ratio this way, rather than using a reference turbine's power off to the side, we do, of course, see these errors, or maybe error is the wrong word, but power ratio is higher than 1 when you yaw the upstream turbine, decreasing its power. And in general, obviously, if the upstream turbine is vane aligned, as shown in the green here, it doesn't matter. But if it's not aligned to the wind, then we are going to see power ratios that are slightly higher than those that would be calculated with a true reference. But these differences appear to be relatively small for, in this example, 15 degrees plus or minus offset of that upstream turbine compared to the overall wake deficit, and really don't impact the wake position measurement too much here either, which is one of the things that we're interested in looking at. So kind of combining all of this together, we have features including the relative wind direction, the upwind vane angle. We're going to throw the downwind vane angle in here as well because the turbines are steering at times. Even that downwind turbine might be steered. And wind speed and turbulence intensity measured at the upstream turbine. Plus, we have the distance between the turbines kind of as a new feature to consider. And our target is the ratio of the downwind turbine's power divided by the upstream turbine's power. Do a whole bunch more filtering. Just again, after a bunch of exploration here, we realized we really needed to simplify the problem a bit, ensure that our turbines are operational and in region 2, so they also have to have power of that, be generating power, some reasonable range on turbulence intensity, wind directions, vane angles, and in some cases, we tried filtering on the turbine pair distance, which is measured in rotor diameters as well. And to avoid some really anomalous power ratios, we cut off the power ratio at a value of 1.6. So our time series data here was 55,000 sample points, 1 minute data points. And when you multiply this out by all the turbine pairs and times, you end up with 760,000 data points. But then when we filter that back down, we have 226,000. And that is still, if we were to compare it to just looking at specific pair of turbines for a specific wind direction, we have a lot more data here to work with, which when it comes to machine learning tends to be beneficial. And as you can see, the data isn't exactly evenly distributed after filtering. Some pairs of turbines have more data than others, as we would expect based on sort of that combined windrows and where those pairs are located and which ones have multiple wakes to deal with. So now we'll jump into this. We're going to use we did explore some different machine learning models, but the one we kind of centered around was using sparse Gaussian process modeling. And this gives us a if you think of it Gaussian process modeling would be a deterministic classification and regression prediction with a quantifiable uncertainty estimate. But it has a cubic scaling in terms of the compute power for training. And that makes it really difficult to fit larger data sets, including the size that we have here. So we switched over to sparse Gaussian process modeling, which reduces the scaling based on a small number of inducing variables. And that approximates the Gaussian process. So kind of some early results here with essentially a fairly standard or typical kernel, 80-20 split of data. And we do that split in time so that we don't get autocorrelation of essentially getting identical data points that are right next to each other in time. So we're going to take the first 80% of the time period in terms of data points and use that for training, and then the last 20% for testing. And what you see here is the test results, predicted power ratio versus actual power ratio. we're really not doing all that well. There's a widespread of actual power ratios that the model is not capturing very well, and kind of the central part of the data. By the way, this gray plot down here is what happens if you plot all of the data points. It's really hard to figure out what's going on. So this is effectively a two-dimensional binning where we do a count, and then the count is the color to show us where the density is. Density plot of those data points. Ideally, if our model was fitting perfectly, it would all fall on this one-to-one line. And to give you an idea what this looks like when we do inference plotting, where we take the model and ask it to make predictions. And in each of these plots, the nominal prediction is the data points here, and then you've got the 95% uncertainty bounds that the model predicts on that. And relative wind direction on the horizontal axis, power ratio on the vertical, and then we're varying one of the other features. So the upwind turbine vane angle varying, or hold that at 0 and vary the turbulence intensity, or hold all of those and vary the pair distance. And what we would expect to see, this is from Flores predictions, is, if we did it, this, by the way, is Flores predictions that are then, these are actual Flores predictions. But we would expect to see this horizontal shifting, which we do kind of see, but the weight is kind of smeared out over a wider distance. We would expect that a lower turbulence intensity is going to produce a greater reduction in the power ratio. And that a change in the turbine pair distance will also, as the turbines get closer together, we see stronger and stronger waking. And we're not really capturing that very well with this initial model when we make these predictions. So kind of looking into this a little bit more, what does our feature space really look like? And obviously it's a challenge to understand a multi-dimensional feature space with more than 3 variables. So we kind of have plotted out different variables here on scatter plots, pair distance, relative wind direction on the horizontal axes, power ratio on the vertical one. You kind of end up with these pretty solid clouds within the filtering bands that we have selected. And likewise, we can look at how do things like wind speed, turbulence intensity, relative wind direction. This is now binned for a specific range of pair distances, the relatively close ones here. Sorry. And in each case, we're maybe there's a little bit of a trend here, but it's hard to see how wind speed is really even influencing that result, and same with these other variables. So this took us to, okay, what does this look like if we model this data in Flores? And so we take the global estimates from the SCADA data for every data point that we have: wind speed, wind direction, turbulence intensity, and then calculate, run that through Flores and get the power of each turbine. And so then we can extract the power ratio of the pairs of interest for each data point. And to be clear, we did not tune Flores specifically to match this wind plant. The goal was to kind of create a generic understanding of what we would expect results to look like. So we used, NREL 5 megawatt turbine, power curve, and so forth, essentially the defaults within the Flores model. But this gives us at least a concept of what we would expect to see. And you can see, now again, this is with all of the same data points here. in terms of the features, but now Floor is predicting the power ratios. And we get results that are, just as scatter plots, substantially easier to interpret. When we start looking at these same slices, we start to see, okay, when wind speed increases, we get a little bit of a narrowing here in the band, if you will. When the turbulence intensity increases, the wake is less severe or significant than when the turbulence intensity is lower. If we look at the upwind vane angle, we see a fairly clear shifting of the wake side to side, as we would expect. And when we look at the downwind angle, a little bit less clear what's happening here. There may be some correlations. To be clear, I should have indicated we used the yaw positions of all of the turbines from the SCADA data when running the Flores analysis. So all of that is baked in here. And so now we kind of looked into, okay, we've got this Flores modeling ground truth. Can we train a machine learning model and really tune our machine learning model to better represent this data? And so that involved a process of going and exploring some different kernels. And so we combined a Mattern kernel with polynomial and linear kernels for some of the different features in order to do this. We expect this sort of nonlinear polynomial response for the relative wind direction and a relatively linear response for things like turbulence intensity, pair distance, and perhaps wind speed. And sure enough, when we do this with a tuned model, tuned kernel in our model, the results are very favorable on this Flores data. We've now consolidated our predictions to be pretty accurately matching our data set, our power ratios generated by Flores, and we see, in the inference plots, the trends that we would expect, including, as our relative wind direction approaches 20 degrees, we're getting back to a power ratio of about 1. As our turbulence intensity decreases, we see a significant decrease in the power ratio, as we would expect, and so forth. Oh, sorry, there was a latent. That's the actual kernel description again. Mattern multiplied by a polynomial for the wind direction, and then a linear summing of additional functions of the other features. So we take that same model and train it on our experimental data. And interestingly enough, the RMSE here did not really improve, but graphically speaking, there is a little bit of an improvement in terms of better fitting the experimental data. Still have that very wide scatter in the actual power ratio that we're not necessarily capturing well, but we do have a relationship, we can identify between the actual and predicted power, even though our RMSE isn't really that much different. And when we look at the inference plots, now we get some sort of interesting and slightly at times wild results. We do see that, wind vane of 0 is producing the largest drop in power ratio, with wind vane angles on that upstream turbine, or yaw angles, creating kind of the expected shifts, but our predictions are also a little bit wild in terms of the amplitude compared, or magnitude of the power ratio compared to what we would expect. Similarly, trend in turbulence intensity roughly along the right lines. So we are gaining, and likewise for changing pair distances. Just another visualization of this between the baseline and the revised model. This is a density plot of all of the data for relative wind direction and power ratio, again, sort of combining all the other features in here. But if we look at what the density plot in the yellow-orange colors is identical between these, but we're now, with the revised model, capturing a bit more of that central trend. So kind of closing out the discussion here with a couple of observations on what we've done. Machine learning was able to capture those florist predicted waking behavior well. But the real data is complex, and not all those details or variability. I guess part of the question is, are all the data details, or is everything that's important captured in the SCADA data? Maybe not, and therefore not in what our machine learning model is able to extract from that data. And that, perhaps combined with the overall scatter, made it challenging for the model to really capture underlying wake steering behavior. We are left with a bit of a question: how do we distinguish between real phenomenon that's captured but not captured in Flores, or are we simply capturing noise in the model? And we think that at least to some extent is still the case. And it kind of leads to some of the other things that we've been discussing in this group and elsewhere. What leads to this large variability in power ratio for similar conditions is one of the big questions, and that leads to a lot of our uncertainty challenges in doing analysis like this, as well as measuring power performance. Those power ratios in the data are real. These are real data points, and the power is reasonably deterministically measured by the turbines. I don't believe that power measurement uncertainty is a significant contributor there. But they're not predicted by Flores, and not, necessarily well captured by our machine learning model. And so, this kind of points into questions around wind direction uncertainty, which I know other folks have been exploring in simulations, and seems to be an important aspect to understand. And perhaps there's other things. So with that, again, acknowledging Windesco for providing the data that was used here, and the funding provided by Northeastern University, and the GEM Fellowship Program for one of our grad students. And happy to take any questions or discuss things.